Set in the 1970s, the movie begins with a boy named David Larry running through the small neighborhood of Hastings, Minnesota. It seems like the typical behavior of a child, except he has a look of genuine terror on his face. In this world, there are only two types of people: the hunters and the hunted. David is one of the hunted. Unfortunately, he ends up in front of a fence he can't climb. On the other side appears his worst nightmare, Roscoe, an enormous evil kid nicknamed Fang because of his pointed tooth. Apparently, David managed to humiliate Roscoe during a spelling class, so Roscoe is far from happy. Even so, the smaller boy asks him to postpone his beating until later, since he has a photo session. In response, the bully demands he say "cheese" before hitting him in the face. Covered in bruises, David is forced to show up for the photo shoot. Later, his mother uses that picture to replace another one in which he's also beaten up. He's been Roscoe's punching bag for years. At least he's not the only victim, since his friends suffer the same torments. One of them is Wolf, a boy with a strange fondness for setting things on fire. Another is Gary, a chubby kid who thinks there are only two food groups: meat and everything else. The last member of the group is Alan, the only black child in town, who has a special talent for fitting his entire fist in his mouth. After getting together, the four kids are astonished by Victoria, the most beautiful girl in their class, who makes them drool simply by saying hello. On the way to school, David hears that a lunar rock is on its way to town. So he starts writing a story in which an old man tries to touch the stone, but government agents shoot him on the spot. Unfortunately, we don't get to see more of this exciting story because David is forced to go to sleep, though he hasn't lost hope of becoming a professional writer. The next day, David plays with his Evel Knievel figure, a daring and brave motorcyclist, the exact opposite of him. On one of its rides, the toy gets intercepted by Roscoe, who decapitates it and throws it into the river. School doesn't provide any safe haven either, as the bully pins him to the ground to beat him, while everyone else ignores it out of fear. Later, the students observe the lunar rock, which Roscoe eyes with peculiar interest. When the kids leave the exhibit, a teacher starts flirting with the stone's guard, while Roscoe watches from a distance. Minutes later, the rock disappears, causing panic at the school. On his way home, the protagonist passes by the riverbank, where Roscoe is admiring his new acquisition, the lunar rock. For obvious reasons, David prefers to leave him alone and go home, where his parents inform him they're moving to another state for work. That's great news for him, so he starts packing enthusiastically. However, before leaving, he wants revenge on Roscoe, so he tells the principal that Roscoe stole the stone. As David leaves town, he sees his arch-enemy getting arrested by the police. It seemed like the protagonist's future was looking bright, although 26 years later, we find him as a failed writer whose novels nobody buys. Worse still, people mistake him for an employee of the bookstore and ask him where the Stephen King section is. As a divorced father, David has to take care of raising his son, Ben, a rebellious kid who only causes trouble at school. Just when David thinks this is how the rest of his life is going to be, he receives a letter from his old high school asking him to teach creative writing for the fall semester. It's the perfect opportunity to start over. Although David is excited to return to his old home in Hastings, his son has trouble adjusting. Part of it is because he'll be the new kid at school and doesn't want his dad to drive him there. Even so, David walks into his old high school with the same excitement as a child and thanks the librarian for indirectly inspiring him to become a writer. In return, the librarian demands he return the book he borrowed. Then David quickly wins over his new students by telling them how they can tell a good story from a lie. After all, that's what fiction is about. After class, David heads to the teacher's lounge, where he reunites with Victoria, now a sex education teacher. Since she has to teach a class, they don't have much time to chat, but they plan to catch up later. Meanwhile, Ben bumps into Kirby, a boy who could very well be David's reincarnation, as he's everyone's bullying target, and Ben is one of the bullies. After the conflict, David is called to the principal's office, where he meets Kirby's father, Ross, a somewhat shy but kind woodworking teacher. After the meeting, the two dads continue talking like friends until David notices something peculiar in Ross's smile. He has a pointed tooth. It's Roscoe himself, his greatest nightmare. Just then, The man remembers they haven't formally introduced themselves, although before David can say his last name, the fire alarm goes off. As everyone evacuates, David runs into Wolf, now a firefighter. Both realize how much they've changed, but they're still amazed by Victoria. That night, the old gang reunites at the local bar, where David confirms that Gary is still overweight and Alan can still fit his fist in his mouth. Their conversation turns to Roscoe, who, according to his friends, was sent to a terrible reformatory for stealing the Luna Rock. After years in that place, he discovered his parents had left town, so he grew up in an orphanage. All of that explains why he's so different now. Speaking of the ex-bully, at this very moment he's getting home, where his disobedient kids are causing chaos and his wife is complaining about his mediocre salary. The only one who gives him a break is little Kirby, who shows him that he's doing homework for Mr. Lure. As soon as Roscoe hears that surname, his face takes on a macabre expression because his favorite victim is back. The next day, Roscoe starts following David through the school hallways until David remarks that they're adults now and shouldn't keep up these childish games. In response, Roscoe just hands him the pen he dropped. But as soon as David regretfully takes it, Roscoe smiles to show him his pointed tooth. From that moment on, David goes to work feeling paranoid, although his arch-enemy is nowhere to be found. Then he runs into Kirby, hanging inside his locker thanks to Ben. To make up for what his son did, the teacher walks Kirby home, sharing tips on how to escape from bullies. They're having a friendly conversation until Kirby's father, Roscoe, appears and threatens David the same way he did in the past. David, terrified, runs off into the woods while the bully laughs at his own joke. Back in town, the protagonist bumps into Victoria, who invites him to the upcoming school dance, an invitation he's wanted since he was 9. At the dance, David is fully focused on his date, while Ben and his buddies look for Kirby. However, his friends get distracted when they see Ben's dad dancing with the hottest teacher, which they think is pretty cool. Then Victoria tells David that she's been in several relationships but hasn't found the right guy yet, which gives David hope. When they go for some punch, they find Roscoe right next to it, so David knocks Victoria's cup out of her hand because he thinks the punch is spiked. In doing so, David goes from being the coolest teacher to the biggest killjoy, disappointing his son. Angry, David confronts Roscoe, who claims that Victoria was getting in the way of their personal relationship, because the return of his favorite victim has brought joy back to his life. On the way home, David runs into Ben, who's heading to the bus station to move in with his mother. David then reminds him they don't even know where she is. Besides, marrying her was a mistake from the start, though at least it resulted in Ben. He tells Ben that he's the best mistake he's ever made. Back at home, Roscoe puts his foot down for the first time in a long while, even throwing the TV into the lake so they won't be distracted anymore. His wife finds this new attitude so attractive that she wants to make love, so he kicks the kids out of the house to avoid interruptions. The next day, Roscoe shows up at school with the same temper. One of the bullies disrespects him, and the shop teacher immediately threatens to smash his face with a huge grinding disc. He warns that everyone will suffer the same fate if they don't follow his rules. Meanwhile, Kirby is taken to Ben, who's supposed to give him a beating, but this time the teenager refuses to hurt him. Kirby himself can't understand why Ben let him off, and Ben says he still hasn't gotten over his parents' divorce. Meanwhile, Roscoe sets up a few traps in David's office. David slips on the floor, falls off his chair, and gets covered in black goo when he tries to use the phone. Enraged, he sets out to get revenge on his enemy. Roscoe makes him trip in a hallway, but David does the same to him moments later, all in front of their children, who have just become friends. Finally, David manages to see the principal to report Roscoe's behavior. However, the principal takes Roscoe's side because of his seniority at the school and threatens to find a substitute for David, claiming his paranoid behavior is scaring the students. Determined to settle things, David summons his enemy to the old seesaw that night. There, Roscoe confesses he's always tormented David because he hopes David will finally fight back. But David points out that he did stand up for himself once, when he reported Roscoe for stealing the Luna Rock. That's exactly why Roscoe lost his childhood, so he hits his former victim in the groin with the seesaw and starts chasing him. David tries to hide in the school workshop while Roscoe describes the cruelty he endured at the reform school, where he was treated like a juvenile criminal. When Roscoe finally finds his target, He fires a bunch of nails in David's direction, but the tool becomes unplugged, giving David the chance to run away again. In the gym, David climbs a rope to hide, but Roscoe begins to burn it. David has no choice but to climb onto the rafters and escape through the ceiling window. The chase continues in the woods, where Roscoe slips, and his foot gets stuck under a rock. David takes the opportunity to keep running, but on the bridge over the waterfall, he spots his decapitated Evel Knievel figure. He must avenge it. Armed with a wooden stick, David finally faces the bully. In trying to dodge the swings, Roscoe ends up plummeting down the waterfall. Filled with regret, David decides to turn himself in at the police station, but Wolf intercepts him, promising to erase all evidence. When David returns home, he finds his son watching TV with Kirby, who asks about his father's whereabouts. While David is trying to fall asleep, Roscoe, who survived the fall, bursts in, wanting to keep fighting. In the middle of this conflict, their children point out they have managed to settle their differences, so the dads should do the same. That calms them down, and they start talking like rational adults. Roscoe admits he stole the lunar rock because he wanted to be an astronaut, even though deep down he knew it was impossible. David responds by telling him not to underestimate himself, because Kirby is living proof he's a great dad. David then notices Roscoe's distinct tooth is broken. Roscoe replies that Fang is gone for good. By the end of the fall, we see David packing his things to move to New York. Victoria sends him off with a kiss, hoping to see him again there. Roscoe also shows up to say goodbye, giving David a brand new Evel Knievel figure. David shakes hands with the man who was once his biggest nightmare, but is now a great friend. However, Roscoe starts chasing him on the road in his RV with his family. You know, old habits die hard.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.